Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John. Thank you, as always, for being here. Tough topic today, so I'm going to listen more than anything, but here we go. What is the worst thing that you know about slavery? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. 40 to 45% of the slaves during the Atlantic slave trades went to Brazil. This was mostly because the slave masters treated them so poorly they wouldn't survive long enough to reproduce. Elsewhere in the world, a slave was considered an investment, but in Brazil, it was an expendable piece of equipment. Slave owners used to take out insurance plans on their slaves in case they died or ran away. The funding for slave catchers who tracked down runaway slaves came in part from insurance payouts. The only company still around that I know of that sold slave insurance was New York Life, or whatever their name is. In the books, it would have been the slave's name, how much was paid for the insurance, and what the payout would be. The thing that always sticks in my mind is the people that they made process sugar in the Caribbean. Apparently, when the sugarcane slurry would get heated up, it would give them incredibly painful third-degree burns if it got on their skin, and it would stick to them and be impossible to get off. It was inevitable that people working near it would get hit with hot lava sugar all day long, all over whatever skin they had exposed, which was probably a lot because it was the Caribbean. Sounds like a punishment they would give someone in hell. I learned recently that once the slaves were brought off the African continent, they could sometimes wait off the African coast for up to 6 months, waiting on Portuguese, Dutch, English, and Spanish ships to fill to max capacity before they made their passage to the Americas. If I recall correctly, Caribbean dialects are much more difficult to understand than African American dialects due to slavery, at least in English. Working conditions in the Caribbean were far more fatal, meaning that a constant stream of new slaves were required, which disrupted the development of their English. In contrast, African Americans were able to reproduce, in many cases forced to, and the development of their children's English was far more fluid. They used to stuff furniture with slave hair. From time to time, restorers will open up an antique chair and find the stuffings as human hair. Just imagine how many slaves it must take to fill a whole seat with hair. Belgian Congo was the personal property of the King of Belgium, and he basically could rule as a god over the whole country and do whatever he wanted to any native. Leopold II commanded personal militias made up of locals who were obviously greatly privileged and who would cut the hands or feet off anyone who did not meet their rubber quotas demanded by the king. Often they opted for the hands of the guy's kid or wife so he could still work at 100% capacity. You have pictures online of piles of cut off hands the militiamen would bring back to their hierarchy to get paid. Greatly disturbing. In pretty much every case where slavery was abolished, the slave owners were compensated and not the enslaved. Compensation basically crushed Haiti. The UK went to the banks to borrow the money to compensate slave owners in 1835, and British taxpayers finished paying off the debt in 2015. That a major invention of modern gynecology, the speculum, was invented by forcing enslaved women into experimentation. J. Marion Sibbs is still considered the father of modern gynecology, and he used enslaved women in much of his experimentation. The prevailing thought was that the enslaved women didn't feel pain, or had deadened nerve endings, or the white dudes just didn't care, which is probably more likely. The horrendous surgeries and experiments done on these women was beyond awful. We often hear about the brutality, the torture, rape, murder, and other horrific abuse of enslaved people. While all of that certainly did happen, there was also the everyday abuse that seems milder, but was persistent. Think about the worst job you ever had and how it felt to work there. Your boss was a dick, you constantly felt disrespected, and couldn't wait for your shift to end to get home. If you were enslaved, there was no going home. That constant feeling of disrespect and despair was with you always. Even worse was knowing that your children would grow up to know the same life. Even the so-called kind masters contributed to it, a true example of the banality of evil. There was a family here who the father and mother were both doctors. They came to an event with their kids and a woman referred to them as Aunt, only Aunt. Basically had her head bowed the whole time and would not eat or do anything the parents didn't tell her to do. They talked down to her. I bet she was their house slave. Then we have the case of a family from the Philippines who had a slave. Read My Family's Slave. Interesting article how the kids try to shame their parents and eventually freed her. Frederick Douglass described in his writings how slaves were fed on the plantations from troughs and were left in a constant state of hunger. He even describes fighting with the dogs for table scraps. I think it says a lot about the inhumanity of the plantation owners who treated slaves like they did barnyard animals. Our food was coarse meal boiled. This was called mush. It was put in large wooden trays or troughs and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs, they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. Throughout the Americas, but as far as I know, especially the North American southern states, young men were encouraged to buy a woman and impregnate her, often raping her, as a sound financial investment, because the offspring, his own children, would be slaves, so he's grown his property. Let me say that again. These men enslaved their own sons and daughters. This was so endemic that Black Americans are genetically distinct from Black Africans, with estimates that something like 25 to 30% of an average Black American's genetics are attributable to European heritage, in particular through the Y chromosome inherited from their European great-great-great-grandfather, who enslaved and had children with their Black great-great-great-grandmother. This was so endemic that it would produce white-presenting children into the slave system after a generation. The interracial children often married amongst themselves, and their children would appear white as often as Black, genetic being a mashup and both having had white fathers and Black mothers. But those white-presenting children were still slaves because they were the offspring of slaves. Some abolitionist papers would publish pictures of these white children in slavery and say, "Is this what you want?" Which, arguing slavery is bad because it also happens to people who look white, is, suffice it to say, not a good argument, but it did at least open some eyes to what was happening in the South. I think a lot of Americans who read about slavery from a history book think of it in very sanitized terms. They imagine it as like some people were forced to live in shitty homes and had to work jobs they didn't choose. The horrifying details which made chattel slavery work are lost. Those people got grok the mechanics that sustained the system, like how many were publicly murdered so that the survivors were too terrified to flee those shitty homes, or that it was so depraved that men were buying women like they were horses with the intent to rape them and enslave their own children. William Ellison, a very intelligent African-American slave, worked for his master in South Carolina at a cotton gin. I say worked for his master because while he was a slave, he was able to make some profit, even though his master took the majority of his profits. He finally makes enough money to buy his freedom. First thing he does, while free, buys land in South Carolina and starts a cotton gin. After years of success, he slowly became one of the largest slave owners in South Carolina. The reason I find it disturbing is because no one, including someone who was once a slave, thought what they were doing was wrong. They just thought it was good business. That when they loaded the slave ship off the African coast, they would chain and pack the people in so tightly they could barely move. And then they would wait until they had a full load, a month, 2, 3, or 6, however long it took. So after living in the hull of a ship in equatorial heat for months, then they got to make the passage. In my state of California, the enslavement of Native American people was so widespread and the slaves were so poorly treated that it resulted in the genocide of several tribes. This is widely taught in California schools, but I rarely see it discussed outside of the classroom. Part of why California slavery was so particularly brutal was that early slavery was often coupled with missionary work, so the enslaved people were also forced to convert to Christianity. Their children were taken from them, and all forms of cultural identity were systemically erased. Even though California entered the Union as a free state, the slavery of Native people continued, usually in the form of punishment for crimes, including being poor. Even after the enslavement of African Americans was banned in California, Native American children were still allowed to be enslaved, while barring Native adults from being enslaved, so slavers would kill the adults and then sell their kids into slavery. By 1860, it was common for Californians to take apprentices, which were de facto enslaved Native children. The laws allowing this practice were not fully repealed until 1937. I spoke to a woman once who was a modern-day escaped slave. If I remember correctly, she told me that her owners would count the numbers of Cheerios that were left after their own children ate to make sure that the slaves hadn't stolen herself any. That they made sure she saw them count the Cheerios to assert dominance. She escaped with the help of a family she befriended at a playground she would take her owners to. She spoke at length about how she loved the two kids she cared for and wished she could see them again, and how she considered them like her own. How she had never and could never blame the children for what their parents had done, but how it led to an emotional conflict whenever she would think back to her time as a slave. I don't think it's ever possible to truly understand the level of emotional and mental turmoil that slavery causes for the slaves unless you've been one. The level of cruelty that simply owning another human being really is all on its own. Just hearing the tone of the woman's voice and how grateful she was to just have a place of her own, able to buy her own food. She made a point to keep a box of Cheerios in the house at all times, to have a job that paid her, employers that treated her well. It's something that impacts you in a way that you just learning about slavery can't do. And even then, it'll never impact you the way living through it would. Indigenous people forced to march on the Trail of Tears owned slaved. Those slaves were forced to carry their possessions and continue to work for their owners if they didn't die on the Trail of Tears, which they did in great numbers. When these indigenous nations reached what is now Oklahoma, they continued keeping slaves. When these slaves were emancipated, they were called freedmen. The freedmen were subject to both Jim Crow restrictions and restrictions on indigenous people. Unlike other descendants of the slaves of Europeans, they had to apply to be allowed to travel out of Indian territory. Today, these indigenous nations periodically attempt to remove the freedmen's descendants from reservations, registrations, and other services. Those who descended from both slaves and indigenous slave owners have been repeatedly rejected from being considered indigenous, despite nations accepting mixed-race light-skinned European descendants. The freedmen have been citizens of the Choctaw Nation, for example in 1885, but the nation refuses to honor this, only grudgingly adding non-blood-proof Dawes Rolls descendants to the Constitution. I come from a band of Choctaw that was kicked out of the Central Nation in the 1820s for being abolitionists, then removed from the Dawes Rolls for supporting the freedmen. We are eligible to enroll now, but most of us refuse to do so. If the freedmen are not entitled to benefits after all they have been forced to go through, then any healthcare, tuition, and land would be like accepting blood money. Slaves were like any other asset. You wanted to keep them valuable as capital. A slave with a lot of scars means disobedient, thus you were devaluing your asset. So you'd only punish a few as an example in case you needed to sell. Many bad slaves wouldn't get the whip so the owner could make profit off them. Basically, slavery also had lemon sales, though it wasn't necessarily a huge problem, kind of like plotting brake fluid in a transmission. Yeah, some people do it to sell a shit car, but more often than not, it's a safe buy. I like to think the guy Frederick Douglass was loaned to was done so fully knowing Frederick would beat the man into the ground. Chattel slavery is an interesting economics read. It's not as simple as slaves do as told, and it becomes clearer that chattel slavery is unsustainable economically and the Civil War was necessary economically, which explains why it was such a huge deal to the North, because we don't go to war for ethical reasons, we go to war for financial reasons. That thousands of slaves that had been freed by the Union Army followed the Army north into Kentucky, a Union state, where they were captured and re-enslaved after slavery had been abolished in the South. Many were not freed until the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments were certain, December 1865, 7 months after Appomattox. Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976. During chattel and transatlantic slavery, the slaveholders raped the babies, the women, the men, the children. They forced relatives to breed if they were considered to be their best stock, so that could be a mother and son, brother and sister. They fed babies to alligators for fun. They tied people to horses and tore off limbs as punishment to make an example of that person to the others. They emasculated the males by raping them in front of others. The women murdered many rape victims of their husbands. They made shoes out of their skin of enslaved people. They took the hair of enslaved people to stuff furniture with. They stole babies from mothers and sold them on never to be seen again. They worked people to death. Unforgivable. The vast majority of African slaves went to the Middle East and not Europe or the Americas. Something like 75% or more of all African slaves went east. They castrated the men. Most didn't survive the procedure, and any children the women had either by other slaves or rape were immediately killed. This is why there aren't any slave descendants there. This trade only stopped when the British Navy blockaded Africa to stop the slave ships and went to war with the slavers in a religious, moral crusade. The War of 1812 sparked off partially because British naval ships based in Canada intercepted an American slave ship in Canadian waters and confiscated it. The US thought because the majority of the British imperial forces were fighting Napoleon, they could annex Canada and get revenge on them, taking their slaves and slave ship. The American forces eventually burned down Toronto and were later chased all the way back to DC, where the Canadian forces set fire to the White House in retaliation.